Of all the endeavours of human history, there is perhaps no other that is simultaneously more great or more terrible than the search for an ever more perfect form of government. Humanity's ongoing need to find a ever more perfect utopian government is perhaps one of its greatest and worst qualities, raising the question, is it even possible to have a utopian government? Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today we're going to be discussing Federation politics. This was requested by Commander Jimbro, who wanted to know, well, a whole load of ins and outs of Federation politics. Now, I've steered clear of this issue previously because, well, it's one of the most difficult things to answer. I can talk all day about Romulan politics and Cardassian politics, Klingon politics, Dominion politics. I can talk all day about that because we understand these systems quite well. We don't actually understand the Federation that well. Star Trek is not particularly clear about the actual inner workings and mechanics of the Federation government. So this is going to be my best assumption based on what we do know about the Federation. Bearing in mind I'm sort of piecing things together rather than presenting a necessarily coherent system. I think there is a coherent system, but it's a lot harder to understand than the other systems we've discussed. And obviously one of the biggest problems in discussing the Federation government is, of course, that the Federation is meant to be a utopian society. But we all have different ideas about what a utopia looks like. Obviously, it can't satisfy everyone, so we're going to compromise. So one of the key things to bear in mind is one of the things I'll really be looking at, the nature of states within the Federation. And also the other thing to bear in mind is, of course, the Federation has existed for only a relatively short amount of time, about 400 years, 300, 400 years. But even within that time frame, it's changed a lot. I mean, physically, it's changed its shape. It doesn't look like what it did back in 2161. This is the other thing, is that this isn't necessarily a perfect match for all periods of Federation history. What I'm actually going to do is go back to the origins of the Federation and see if we can find the skeleton, the initial framework on which the Federation was built, to then understand this larger edifice that we then have in the 24th century. So, get right into it. The Federation is formed in 2161, comprising the governments of the United Earth, Vulcan, Tellar, and Andoria. These aren't brilliantly named, if I'm honest, and kind of don't give a lot of description or detail. The thing is that one of the big confusions that immediately comes up is if your species is a member of the Federation, let's say you were born outside of the Federation, but your species are a member of the Federation, does that make you a Federation citizen? Well, no. It's not that the Vulcans, Andorians, and humans and Tellarites joined the Federation. It's that the nations joined together. Actually, this is where I'm going to come back to Franz Joseph's Starfleet Technical Manual. So in Franz Joseph's Technical Manual, we have an insignia for the various member states of the Federation, and they include the United Nations, the Planetary Confederation of 40 Eridani, the United Planets of 61 Cygni, the Star Empire of Epsilon Indi, and the Alpha Centauri Concordium. That last one is perhaps the most interesting, because, of course, that suggests that Alpha Centauri was an independent state, which does actually make an awful lot of sense. So, as I say, it's the states that join the Federation, not the species. You can't represent the species. You can't speak for all people of say, an ethnic group. It's not like ethnic groups have a, supreme ruling council. So, essentially, your Federation citizenship is not tied to your species at all, but it is tied to your planet of origin. If you come from a Federation planet, you will be by default a Federation citizen. Now, by extension, what that means is not all humans are citizens of the United Earth. As I say, we have here the Alpha Centauri Concordium, and I think it's also previously defined that Mars is a protectorate of Earth rather than a extension of the United Earth, it's a United Earth protectorate. So the United Earth is the overall representative body of the solar system, but Mars is its own independent protectorate. This means that we have all kinds of different ways of describing a human. Not only do we, of course, have Terrans, which then becomes a useful term because we're referring to a human from Earth, we also, of course, have Martians, Centaurians, Alterans, and Vegans.
Yes, I left the Delta Vega mining colony, and before I left, though, I got breakfast done, and I had some lovely Vega and sausages. It was very, very delightful, very tasty.
Upon signing the treaty to join the Federation, to form the Federation, these states still remain states. They are still their own independent state entities, and if they were to ever leave the Federation, then their original borders upon signing up to the Federation would be theirs again. Now, that raises a question, well, what about colonies? Who owns the colonies? So in order to avoid competition and rivalry between the member states, colonies are considered effectively blank slates, regardless of the majority species. Now, obviously, particularly in the early part of the Federation, where we have these 4 species working together, and they're all very different, they're not going to be looking to colonize the same worlds. So odds are you are going to end up with a lot of colonies that are majority Vulcan, majority Andorian, Tellarite, and human. But just because you have a majority population of Andorians does not mean that that planet then becomes part of Andoria. As I say, that could create unnecessary tension. What about the, 40% of humans that live there, or, whatever? So that doesn't work. So instead, what basically happens is colonies are considered blank slates and are treated as federal protectorates, so they are under the overall authority of the Federation and the Federation Council, and they will eventually become states of their own. Basically, there are certain prerequisites that you have to satisfy in order to become a voting state of the Federation, tied to development, population, etc., etc. Don't do anything weird like genetic engineering or slavery. Don't do those things, and, it should all be golden. Now, obviously, if you do have planets that are majority Vulcan or majority human, they may end up electing similar representatives to their homeworlds. Equally, there's actually probably a pretty good chance that they will be different, because if you are leaving your homeworld, it's probably because you feel differently to the people who already live there. And so actually, different aspects of different species are probably going to be reflected in their various colonies. Some are going to be more free-thinking, some are going to be more perhaps conservative. It's going to vary. And also an important thing to note is we have the quote that the Federation comprises hundreds of planets. Well, that doesn't actually mean hundreds of species. That means hundreds of these planetary states, some of which will actually be of the original founding 4. It doesn't actually necessarily mean that there are hundreds and hundreds of species in the Federation. That's ultimately up to you to decide how many alien races you want in Star Trek. So, what are the perks of joining the Federation? Well, on the face of it, it doesn't sound like much. Basically, you get free trade and free movement, but conditionally. The thing is think about this. You've got these different species, all of which have very different demographics, and all of which have very different economies, but also all of which are, independent and had their own internal economies. As I previously mentioned when talking about, I believe it was the Rockwell class, or why all Starfleet ships look human, and one of the things I was saying in that video was that yes, there is free trade in the Federation. It didn't immediately start out like that, because everyone has to protect their own industries. Earth, during the Romulan War, obviously there was a massive build-up in its shipbuilding sector, for fairly obvious reasons. And that's fine, but if they just immediately were allowed to, free market it, they would probably put all the Andorian, Vulcan, and Tellarite shipyards out of business. And long-term, for the long-term prosperity of the Federation, that's not good. And again, it means that one member has a point of leverage over other members. Some industries are, of course, more critical than others. And, of course, that then breaks down the equality of the Federation. So there is a dichotomy and a balance to be struck, of course, between freedom and equality, at least when it comes to overall states. You need to maintain the balance between all these states. They will actually need to be, equal partners. Otherwise, the Federation does just become a Homo sapiens only club, or a Vulcan shadow government, or whatever other conspiracy theory we're talking about today, Mr. Reloaded. So while there is free movement and free trade, it is managed and it's not instantaneous, but you don't want too much of an economic imbalance. You also don't want a massive coreward pull. You don't want to create a black hole effect where all of the economy of the Federation centers on the founding four, and then these worlds just get absolutely swamped with people because it's where everything is, and then the rest of it is just hollowed out. You don't want that either. So it does require a level of managerialism. However, the most prominent perk of joining the Federation is joint defense, and this is guaranteed. Now, as I pointed out previously, colonies are not states and don't have seats in the Federation Council. Now, they are meant to have their needs tended to as protectorates, but they are not treated the same way as sovereign voting members of the Federation Council. It's just not feasible. You've got to draw the line somewhere. Now, another interesting part of the defence question is, can you retain your own forces? This is very interesting. From what we can see, states that join as states seem to be able to, yes, preserve their own military forces. I honestly don't know, for example, what the Andorians do, given that, the need for Andorian warships is very limited, while Tellarites, they're probably quite happy building their own merchant vessels. And the Vulcans, they like doing science, and they're going to build their own devoted science ships. So there's obviously a freedom there to keep doing what you have previously been doing to best serve the interests of your state. The states are still free to pursue their own individual endeavours under the umbrella of the Federation. Just now they have the benefits of mutual defence and a united fleet. Now, again, going back to the colonies, seems to be a bit more debatable, and I'll be covering this in future videos, particularly when we talk about the post-war world of the Federation, because a Federation militia doesn't sound like half a bad idea, but given history prior to the Dominion War, you can also see why it looks like a terrible idea. So I'll park that and we'll come back to that in another video. As I say, local governments remain with a pretty significant amount of freedom. There are, again, as I say, obviously things that you can't be doing. As a member of the Federation, you have to play ball on pretty basic issues. So really, the Federation Council is an outwardly focused organisation. It's to take care of foreign policy, effectively, while most of individual, state-to-state stuff happens within their original governing structure, whatever that was. So this brings us now to the legislature. So the Federation Council, suffice it to say, it's large, very large, and consists of elected representatives. I'm assuming that, simply on the basis of practicality, that the Federation Council has staggered elections, i.e. each world votes for its council member in its own time, but there's not, mass general election for the entire house, because that would just be, logistically, that would be all over the place. That would be insane. And there's no evidence to suggest that's what happens. So, staggered elections. There are no political parties, not because, like the Romulans, they've been banned, and there's an, nefarious secret spy organisation that's making sure that political parties aren't formed. It's more that it just doesn't make sense. There's no reason to fundraise for campaigns. Anyone can stand for election. We exist in a world of prosperity. So you don't have to pay for an election. You just have to stand. And at that point, yeah, you don't need to fundraise or anything like that. And also, everyone's interests are going to be so diverse and disparate from one planet to the next that it doesn't really make sense for there to be political parties. I'm sure in the Federation Council you'll get certain coalitions and voting blocks, but I suspect that it's basically just a collection of independents working together over certain issues. So I think just by the nature of the Federation, I think it naturally favours independent candidates, and that with the sheer scale of the Federation, actually a bipolar political system doesn't work. That then brings us to the president, who is, I believe, elected separately. I suspect that the president is voted for in a Federation-wide election. And so the president of the Federation, obviously, they are the head of state. They are more than a mere political leader. The whole idea for a Federation president would be to elect a model citizen, someone who embodies the ideals of the Federation, somebody who is, a model citizen, and so is not divided by politics, by this issue or that issue. It's more that they will have an overall philosophy that they will use to, I say govern, but it's more lead. Govern implies a level of, top down, do what I say, whereas when I say lead, that's more, come on, follow me, I've got a way ahead sort of thing. If I had to pick a modern example, I would actually say that the best comparison is the President of Ireland. Ireland is a republic, but it also, because of its connections to Britain, has a parliament and a prime minister, who is the actual political leader, whereas the President of Ireland is just the head of state. So does all the head of state things that, for example, the King does in England. And in this instance, you have Michael D. Higgins, who... Okay, look, I'll be honest, most of my exposure to Michael D. Higgins is seeing him meeting the royals, where it's all very nice and affable, and also rugby games. He particularly liked big international rugby games in Ireland. He'll be there and greet the players, and risking myself here, but for no particular reason, he does feel like a very good symbol of Ireland. You think of an Irishman, he does definitely come to mind, and I think that's what a Federation president should be like. A kind of a peacemaker in government, a friend to all, someone who leads the way and tries to bring people together and solve issues, rather than, I'm for one side or the other. I know, what crazy sci-fi this is. Now, there is a bit of a complication, which is the President of the Federation the President of Earth? I'm going to presume not, but equally we do see in Paradise Lost that President Jaresh Inyo, as the leader of the overall Federation, he's ultimately calling the shots about how they go about defending Earth. Which is interesting, because surely they'd be speaking to the President of Earth. Presumably it's just because whoever they are, they just have to subordinate to the Federation authority, given that ultimately this is not a question of local governments, it's actually a question of Federation defense and Federation security, not just Earth. Obviously it's taking place on Earth, but the overall threat is of course larger than just Earth itself. Another thing to consider when looking at how democracy works in the Federation is, of course, what kind of voting system do we have in place? Do we have first past the post? Do we have proportional representation? What makes the most sense? I think overall we have to first decide upon how many a single seat represents. How many people does a single seat in the Federation Council represent? I'm going to say maybe something like 500 million to 1 billion, something like that. So obviously major Federation worlds will have multiple seats in the Federation Council, while potentially smaller worlds have only one, or in fact none at all. Now, of course, this begs the question, well, okay, how do you get representation as, a small colony? Well, obviously you could try and get your population numbers up to get your own seat in the Federation Council, but I suspect what would be more likely and makes more sense, particularly for small colonies, is to confederate. So essentially, basically, a group of colonies get together, a group of worlds get together who individually don't meet the requirements to have a seat in the Federation Council, but pool all those resources together, pool your population and your economic resources together, and then suddenly you're actually eligible for a seat in the Federation Council, obviously under the banner of, the Frontier Alliance or the Aldebaran Republic, for example. So essentially you are, taking multiple colonies and they're pooling their resources together to form a voting bloc in the Federation Council. Now, of course, these planets will still have their own individual governments, which will do the day-to-day running of those worlds. But in the Federation Council, they can be represented by a confederated representative who is elected by all of them. So, first past the post or proportional representation? Well, I think overall, given that first past the post kind of favours political parties, wholesale political parties. For example, let's look at the, voting of Earth, and Earth has 20 seats total up for grabs. If it was first past the post, that would mean the political party who won the majority of votes, even if it was by, one vote, would then get all those seats. It would be winner takes all. I don't think that makes much sense. So I think a much more sensible answer to that is proportional representation. So essentially then those seats are then divided up according to the vote share until you don't have enough votes to fill the seats. So effectively for, small confederations, it's not really going to matter because they're only ever going to get one representative anyway. But for larger electors, for large constituencies, it means that they're going to have a plurality of different representatives. And again, it helps discourage the idea of partisan party politics, which, like I say, don't make sense for the Federation. So what about the president? How is the president elected? Well, that is going to be surely by popular vote. And so how does that work? Is it whoever gets the majority? I would say so. Standing for president is probably a more complicated thing. I would think to stand for Federation president, you can't just be anyone. You have to have rendered some kind of civic duty. So I would say that, it makes sense that people who had served in the Federation Council, Federation ambassadors, Starfleet captains, they can probably stand for election to the office of Federation president. And it also means that the president then has an understanding of the various institutions that they have to cooperate with, whereas otherwise you've just got this person who comes in, has no political experience, knows nothing of these institutions, and is suddenly asked to deal with all these disparate organs of the state. The president is obviously going to be working with the elected chamber, so the Federation Council. They're also going to have to work alongside the Federation courts. Presumably the president is also actually going to engage in a lot of direct state visits with other species, and indeed within the Federation as well. Not just with people that aren't members of the Federation, but within Federation members as well. And also has to deal with Starfleet. So it's quite important that actually the Federation president has experience in at least one of these fields, given how complicated they are. So overall, I think likelihood is we would see some kind of proportional representation system. You would see probably smaller planets confederating together to form voting blocks so that they can get representation in the Federation Council. And then you'd see a plurality of different representatives representing larger planets and nations and states within the Federation. So that's how voting works in the Federation. Now, finally, this brings us to the last bit that I want to talk about, which is trade and industry. There's one big question which I thought about when thinking about the economy of the Federation. A massive tripping up point, because as I previously mentioned, free trade, and that sounds lovely. But one of the key tripping up points you're going to come across almost immediately is weights and measures. It's pretty clear, we see in a lot of dialogue in Next Generation that they use normal metric measurements. So you say, oh, well, obviously they adopt the metric system. I'm going to actually give a suggestion here, which is that this is a similar issue to a Star League ton. For those of you that don't know, a Star League ton is a thing from BattleTech. In BattleTech, you have these giant stompy robots that are like the size of houses, and they do fighting, and they are classed by tonnage, ranging from 25 tons up to 100-ton behemoths. But the thing is, you look at those mechs and you look at how big they are, and you go, that thing would weigh way more than 100 tons. That's not even going to get close. More like, 500 to potentially 1,000 tons. So in the world of BattleTech, there's this idea of the Star League ton, which is this universal measurement, and it sounds like a modern day ton, but actually it means something different. So that actually things that are 50 tons today might be only 25 tons under the Star League ton. And I think it's perhaps a similar issue in Star Trek. Let's just bear in mind that when it comes to weights and measures, to this day, the planet can't agree, with still a few holdouts that like to say that 50 degrees is cold. Essentially, of course, Earth has two systems, primarily. The Imperial system, which is basically rule of 12 times tables, because that's a number we're very good at handling. Whereas, of course, the metric system is decimal, operates in tens. Now, while I did just diss Fahrenheit, I am actually going to be fair here and point out that, technically speaking, all measurement systems are arbitrary. What is a kilogram? It's an object. It's an object called the kilogram, and it sits in Paris in a jar. That's the kilogram. Because back in the 19th century, a group of scientists got together and said, if we agree that this is 1 kilogram, then we can measure everything else. We can, of course, tune our instruments to that, and then we can measure everything else relative to that. But that is the kilogram. It's arbitrary. Now, there is maths behind it that I am not smart enough to comment on, but that even if you were to work back that math, you're still working it to get to this arbitrary thing that is the kilogram, that somebody just sat down one day and said, this is 1 kilogram. Now, you might say, okay, well, in space, there's some kind of universal thing. Well, no. So, you say the speed of light. Yeah, how do we measure the speed of light? Call it a light year. A Vulcan light year is not going to be the same as a human light year, because a human light year is how far light travels in 365 days. A Vulcan light year could be how far light travels in 422 days. Now, you can perhaps reconcile from that. I think that ultimately for the Federation, a new system has to be created that will, end up looking like the metric system because it's fundamentally sensible, but that will, almost start again from basics, like go down to the atomic level and say we can quantify 1 atom and then work things up. I mean, that would also explain why we have measurements of microns. Microns are a completely new term that Star Trek came up with, but it does make sense in terms of you're measuring atomic distances, then molecular distances, and then, up and up you go in a metric fashion. So I think that there would be a universal system of weights and measures employed in the Federation. Simply put, the Federation has to. If they're all going to build the same starships, they have to have the same system of weights and measures. Without a universal system of weights and measures, none of the economy of the Federation could work. So I think it would probably be a mathematically generated formula from observation of the fundamental forces of the universe, and would be devised by the Vulcans, because the Vulcans are good at that kind of thing, and that will become the new universal, and will just so happen to sound like kilometers, meters, kilograms, so on and so forth. I realised that I was meant to talk about the economy of the Federation there, but I feel like the far more interesting question there was weights and measures. Maybe that can be another time. Just to wrap things up, so the Federation is easily the hardest form of politics to understand. It's the hardest government to understand. And I think that ultimately is tied to the fact that it has the greatest ambition. As a political system, it has the greatest scope and ambition. The Romulans and Cardassian states, they're very monolithic, they're very easy to understand, they exist to serve a certain purpose. The Klingon state, that's more of a culture given the form of a state. The Federation, by contrast, is a much more flexible and dynamic entity. It is a framework which allows the cooperation of free sovereign states, promoting close union between these states while also respecting their sovereignty. Therefore, it is a necessarily flexible, complex, somewhat Byzantine system that is going to be difficult for us to understand by our modern conception of politics. Fundamentally, we have to consider that the most key part of the Federation is it must have room to grow. It must be a dynamic system capable of expanding and evolving. The Federation of the 22nd century looks very different to the Federation of the 24th century, and that too will likely look very different to the Federation of the future, because it is inherently a dynamic system, and that is what has led to it being the most successful and powerful state in the quadrant. So, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Jimbro, I hope I satisfactorily answered your question, and I will see you all in the next video.
Next, I am going to be attending the opening of Tippy Togland. Yes, delightful experience for the whole family. Hopefully, the weather will be clear for the opening, and the skies will be a beautiful blue.